This is the second part of today's session on memory here in cognitive neuroscience. In the previous part, in the introduction, we've learned about the multi-store model of memory by Atkinson and Shiffrin, and also we looked at several challenges to the model due to empirical findings that contradicted some of the assumptions of that model. So for now we will look at a response to these challenges to the multi-store model, namely a novel model that was proposed by Baddeley and Hitch called the working memory model. Working memory as a concept is very similar to short-term memory. It serves the same purpose, namely to maintain information for a limited amount of time, but it has slightly different properties. So according to Baddeley and Hitch, working memory consists first of all of a central executive. The central executive is a supervisory system that only controls the flow of information, so it doesn't have a store itself. It is really just an attentional system that controls what information is going where and which information is being dropped. It is connected to two subsystems that do have some storage, namely a visual storage, the visual spatial sketchpad, and an auditory storage, namely the phonological loop. And a third system here that is connected to the central executive is an episodic buffer. So this is more of a passive system that allows the integration of information, and this also has a limited capacity. Long-term memory with an unlimited capacity is outside of working memory but related. So as you can see, the subsystems of working memory are connected to specific modules in long-term memory. So for example, the visual spatial sketchpad is related to visual semantics in long-term memory, or the phonological loop is related to language. And as you can see, there's these modules that are connected to one another. They facilitate the exchange of information from long-term memory to working memory and vice versa. To give you an example of how these working memory modules work, I want you to do a task now, namely close your eyes and then count the windows that are in your flat or house that you currently live in. So without looking at your room, without going through your house or flat, close your eyes and just count them. And you can stop the video now while you're doing this and then resume the video when you have a number. So I'm not sure how you did this, but a lot of people, what they would do is they would mentally walk through their house and create an image of the rooms and then count the windows. And this is exactly where you need several subsystems of working memory according to the model by Hitch and Baddeley. The central executive, you need to conceive of a strategy. So for example, to mentally walk through your house and count the windows. You also need attention so that you can select the relevant rooms, the relevant walls, and so on. The visual spatial sketchpad then is used for imagery. So you need a mental image of a wall of a room to being able to count the windows. And then the phonological loop would be used for the counting itself. So in order to keep track of the current number, you may constantly keep a number in mind and count up until you're done with the task. Another assumption of the working memory model by Hitch and Baddeley is that there is different working memory subsystems. And this was tested with the dual task method. So again, the assumption of working memory is that there's a limited capacity and that working memory is gradually filled up. If working memory is filled due to one task, then there should be fewer resources in a second task as a consequence of that assumption. So this was tested in the dual task paradigm, where participants had to do two things. First, they had to remember a number of digits, something like a telephone number basically, So they're presented a number of digits and they have to keep them in mind, and then they're tested. The second task was that they had to do some kind of reasoning, so some kind of logical deduction. I'm going to give you an example so you get an idea of what participants did in this task. And if you want to, you can do the task yourself at home now. So there will be a countdown, and then you will see a number of letters. In this task it's letters, and your task is to remember these letters. While you're doing this, you need to do a second task, namely some kind of reasoning task. There will be a statement, and then you have to decide if it's true or false. And then after that, you're being asked to recall the letters that you initially learned. Okay, if you're ready, you can start this now. Okay, do you remember the letters? Here they are. And for the verbal reasoning task, the correct answer is actually true. B precedes A. So that was true. Let's do another example. Same task. Do you remember the letters? Here they are. And in this case, the verbal reasoning task, false would be the correct answer, because A does not follow B, it precedes B. Alright, so I don't know if it was much trouble for you doing this task. It's quite challenging sometimes because you need to do two things at the same time. Let's see what the participants did in Batch and Hidley's experiment. So what you can see here, the filled lines are the arrows in reporting the digits or letters. So this was pretty much stable, even for a relatively for a relatively high number of digits. The error rate was still relatively low. But at the same time, there was some increase in the performance in the second task, the reasoning task. This is the empty circles here. So the time increased, suggesting that the resources that were taken for performing the digit task were lacking to do the verbalization task. And the more items there were in the auditory loop, the phonological loop, the more difficult or the longer it took participants to do the reasoning. However, it is also important to note that even though there was some impairment, the task is still possible. So participants could still do the task, and this clearly suggests that the central executive is quite powerful, can overtake the reasoning task, while the phonological loop is really just used for the digit task. So this shows that that even though both tasks might use the phonological loop, the central executive allows switching between tasks and doing two things at the same time. In a second experiment using the dual task method in a slightly different paradigm, there was further evidence provided for a modularized working memory, so for working memory systems that are more specialized, as predicted by the working memory model. Here in this task, participants had to do they had to monitor changes in items. So for example, they were presented these 4 images here for some time, and then they disappeared from the screen. They had to memorize them. Then 4 images appeared again, and participants had the task to say whether there was a change or not. As you can see, there was a change here. one of the scenes changed. And yeah, so in order to do this task, you have to keep these items in memory. There were two conditions. So this is the single category condition, because all the 4 items were from the same category, namely city scenes. Here you can see a trial in which there were mixed categories, namely food and city scenes. And also you can see that in this trial there was no change. So what would you expect is easier? I'll give you a second to think about that. Well, the behavioral findings showed that the mixed category trials is easier than the single one. So when you had to remember food and city scenes, this was easier than just city scenes or just food. And this is interesting, but with neuroscientific methods we can actually get an idea of why that is the case. So using fMRI data, what the researchers showed is that there's different areas that represent the different image types. So objects, in this case the food, are represented, for example, here. It's not really important where it is. And then the city scenes are represented here. And in yellow here you can see the overlap. Now the interesting finding was that the mixed benefit, so how much better you were for mixed than for single category trials, that benefit was strongly negatively correlated with the overlap in this brain area, the occipitotemporal cortex. So that means if you were particularly good in the mixed category trials compared to the single category trials, then your overlap was relatively small. So this was interpreted in a way that if there's little overlap, there's a little competition in these areas, and you can overall use a wider span of neural populations to code the information, working memory. And this results in a more efficient processing. Let's have a look at another claim that the working memory model makes, namely that there is a phonological loop. Again, something you can do at home. Try to remember the following numbers. Okay, here they are. Are you correct? You might be. That's 5 digits. Let's do another one. Okay. Do you remember all of them? And a last example. So how many people could remember the last task with how many do we have here? 12 digits. Probably only very few of you could do that. I could certainly not do that. What most people can remember is 7 plus minus 2 of these digits. And the best way to do this task, and that's the way that most people do it, is saying the numbers in your head, basically reading them in your head. And this is evidence for the phonological loop. This was experimentally tested by George Armitage Miller in 1956, a very influential paper. I think this is maybe the most cited psychological paper ever. What he did is, in a variety of tasks, he tested participants with different stimuli, and these results indicated that participants can usually keep 7 plus minus 2 items in mind. From these results, the idea resulted that short-term memory or working memory has slots. And then the question, of course, is what can be stored in a slot? So is it a digit, is it a number of digits, or is it maybe chunks? Because there's some evidence that you don't necessarily put single digits in these slots, but by chunking information together in a meaningful way, you can actually increase your capacity because several digits can go into one slot. I'm going to give you an example of how this might work. So again, this is a task for you to do at home now. Try to remember these digits. Okay. Very difficult. These digits do probably not have any meaning for most of you. Let's try this example here. Okay, I don't know how you did this, but a lot of people can do this much more efficiently than the previous task, because there's actually just 3 years that you have to remember. 1659, failure of the Commonwealth, 1707, Act of Union, and 1945, end of World War II. So by chunking these digits into 3 chunks, you can actually store them much more efficiently than here. There are also several limitations of the phonological loop. So, for example, pit, day, cow, pen, top is easier than mat, map, can, man, cap. So the similarity of words seems to affect the span of the phonological loop. Huge, big, wide, large, tall is also relatively easy, so it's the similarity of the sound, not the similarity of the category or the meaning, which again is evidence that it is really a phonological representation rather than an abstract representation of the words. Another finding is that some, hate, harm, wit is easier than association, opportunity, representative, organization. So the length of the sound does also seem to be relevant. It's not just the number of words, but the phonological loop really seems to be related to how long a word is, how long it takes to process and repeat the word in your mind. And there's again empirical evidence for exactly that. So the more syllables a word has, the fewer words can actually be remembered. So you can see words with 5 syllables. So the percentage of words recalled correctly are in red here. And as you can see, the more syllables they have, the fewer words you can remember. And this is actually very clearly correlated with the reading speed, so how long it takes you to say the word. And this led to the calculation of around 2 seconds of length for the phonological loop to last. So anything you can say in 2 seconds, you can store in short-term or in working memory. Another claim by the working memory model is that a central executive is critical and distinct from other working memory systems. And there's some evidence for a clear distinction between the central executive and other working memory systems provided in this study by Owen and colleagues in 1996. This was a PET study, PET. The task was as follows. There were two tasks. So there was a spatial monitoring task, and in this task participants had to click on red circles until one of them turned blue. This one didn't turn blue. This one turned blue. And then in the next trial they had to search again, so they were all going red again, and they had to avoid touching the previous target location. And there were 8 trials per round. So what this task required was a constant updating of working memory. So you need to keep track of a specific location that you're not supposed to click on again, and then each trial you need to add one item to that. And the idea would be that this probably requires the central executive to quite a large extent, because you need attentional control and you need to get access to the stored information and then update it again and again. In the second task, a passive working memory task, this was conceived to involve the central executive less. Here, participants have just seen a sequence, something like this. So a sequence of blue dots, and they had to simply reproduce that sequence. So there was no manipulation of the stored sequence required, and there was no updating of working memory required. So all these things that are thought of as being, as the central executive being important for them, these things were not involved in the passive working memory task. And then the interesting thing is that the PET scan revealed that there's different brain areas being active in these two different tasks. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was more active for the spatial monitoring task, and the VLPFC, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, was more active for the passive task. So distinct neural substrates for these two tasks indicate that indeed the central executive is a distinct module in working memory and distinct from other working memory systems. Alright, so we have learned what working memory is now, and in the next part of today's session we will learn how to measure working memory.